welcome everyone to this final meeting of the MC podcast series. I would like to welcome you to this meeting. My name is Odysseas Christou. I'm an assistant professor in government, international law, and international relations with the School of Law of the University of Nicosia. I specialize in European energy and environmental law, and my current research focuses on the evolution of energy and environmental law and policy, as well as their effect on regional and international security relations. Our topic for the day is going to be the European Green Deal, its impact on the region and also more broadly, and with respect to the post-COVID-19 landscape. Joining me today are two esteemed colleagues from quite different backgrounds and different areas of expertise. This is a topic that is very multifaceted, and their different perspectives are really going to help us in order to consider this topic from a variety of viewpoints and issues. Let me briefly introduce them. Dr. Kirsten Westphal is a senior associated with the Global Issues Research Division of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the SWP, where she also heads the project on the geopolitics of energy transformation. She has published widely on various issues of EU, but also global energy policy, and her latest research has focused on topics such as the geopolitics and international governance of hydrogen and energy more generally, including the developments of COVID-19, as well as the politics of sustainable energy transitions and the European Green Deal itself. Dr. Nestor Fylaktos is a postdoctoral fellow at the Energy, Environment, and Water Research Center of the Cyprus Institute. He holds a PhD from Imperial College London on mathematical modeling of socioeconomic impact of renewable energy in isolated communities. His current research interests extend to the decarbonization of the economy, the technical and economic aspects of new energy systems and energy futures, and modeling of the Mediterranean and EU regions. Let me warmly welcome you both. I am very excited by your participation, and I am sure you are going to help us understand this topic much, much better, especially for a layman audience that may be encountering the topic of the European Green Deal for the first time. So let me make a very brief introduction to the topic before I turn over the floor to our colleagues and ask them to give us their input on their areas of expertise. The European Green Deal is the culmination of a very extensive set of policy and legal initiatives by the European Union in the energy, but also with a very major focus on environmental regulation. Prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis, it was actually established as the top item on the policy agenda of the European Commission. Of course, when the crisis started, our priorities changed by necessity. It represents a great leap in the trajectory that I already talked about on previous policy initiatives, and among many other policy objectives, including increasing the EU's climate ambition for 2030, the supply of clean, affordable, and secure energy, the mobilization of industry in the creation of a clean circular economy, the move towards better uses and efficient uses of energy, the creation of a zero pollution environment, and many, many other things, some of which have already been put in place and others that are going to be put in place through a series of many steps over the next few years. The overarching aim is the achievement of climate neutrality for Europe by the year 2050. Something that for many, not that long ago, might have sounded like science fiction. The idea that an entire continent might achieve climate neutrality. After the onset of the crisis, the European response has been a convergence between the policy goals, as we have seen from the EU, of managing the public health crisis and fostering sustainability. Only yesterday, the conference of the EU ministers for the environment called precisely for this type of action, for accelerating our treatment and management of environmental and energy challenges, and also converging them towards our management of the crisis. That by way of a very short introduction. I wanted to begin with a general assessment of the European Green Deal. So let me first ask Dr. Westphal, given how ambitious and far-reaching, at least in generality, it seems to be, how likely do you think it is to meet its goals? In two ways, in both measurable targets and also in terms of general policy aims.
I have to unmute myself. Hello. Nice to take part. This is the €1 million question. I think what is very important is that there is a real strong push and moment this time to really move forward. Because as you said, Odysseas, the EU Commission has come out. This was this first launch in November 2019 to really say we want to have a Green Deal. And we want to be a geopolitical commission. And I think you have to think this together, because the clear message was that the European Union wants to become a leader in climate and in climate policies, but also moving ahead with sustainable development. Why am I emphasizing that? Because it has both dimensions. This would be my first take. We have to look into the internal dimension. And as you know, it has never been very easy to establish a consensus among the now 27 member states. Plus, there is this external dimension, which I think is becoming even more important right now with the COVID-19 pandemic still going on, actually. Can't think about the post-pandemic situation, but we really are still in between, within the wave. So I think we have to see both dimensions. And then Ursula von der Leyen was very outspoken, and I think she's right in saying that's Europe's man on the moon moment. And this is already part of my answer to your question. It's very early to say, actually, whether we're really going to achieve that. And I think, as you rightly pointed to, we neither have the regulatory framework at hand right now, nor do we have the technologies. And I think Dr. Fylaktos keep working on, but it's now a moment where we have to be very clear for the direction we want to go to. And then, as you said, I mean, the Green Deal is very broad. It doesn't only cover energy, but to me, it's the first time where the EU takes not only a step, or you can't even say a step, but a movement into an integrated energy and climate policy. This is something we're having since 2007. But it's kind of marrying energy and climate policies with technology and industrial policies. And I think this is extremely important, because of course the priority number one in this Green Deal is a climate neutral Europe, as you said. And here again, it links to the external dimension. It doesn't talk about the climate neutral EU, but it really talks about a climate neutral continent. And then you have already, with the second priority, you have a much broader approach thinking about circular economy. And we've seen precision here at the beginning of the month, actually last week, with the new communications on hydrogen, but also on energy system integration, which is extremely important and which also talks about a more circular energy system with energy efficiency, but also recycling and all this kind of stuff. And then also building renovation is extremely important, but also, of course, measures in transport and then research and development are very important. I'm emphasizing this all because this was the start. But then, as you said, we are kind of in a new situation with the pandemic and the lockdowns. And I think, to me, this was already the major crucial moment. And the Commission was very clear with its recovery plan to, how is it called, to repair and renew for the next generation, by saying, yes, the Green Deal is still the paradigm for our recovery program, because if we want to spend such a lot of money, and 560 billion euros are foreseen in this new recovery and resilience facility, should be, that means a lot of debt for coming generations. And this also means that we should build infrastructure that the next generations can use. So I think this was the decisive moment that we had, basically since March and April. And there was also another emphasis very much linking to this internal consensus, which I would highlight here, is the Just Transition Fund also, in order to buffer these kind of structural changes that are needed. And we're thinking primarily, or we're talking primarily, for example, in Germany, about coal regions and coal phase out. But of course, this has huge implications at the end of the day also for refineries. It has a lot of implications for natural gas, which has to be decarbonized, which has to be decarbonized as well. So I think this is extremely important to have this in mind. Just maybe to finalize or finish here with the first outlook is that, of course, the implications are huge for the sectors that I mentioned. Electrification, there is the issue of modernization, there is the issue of digitalization, but also interconnections. We know that electricity is becoming more and more important, and we've seen that also in the pandemic, that electricity played a crucial role in meeting, the health requirements, but also, as we are talking now virtually, but also to keep our social contacts alive. So we will see a major focus on electricity, but of course, the Green Deal has also vast implications for oil and gas markets. And as we've all seen, the pandemic has hit oil and gas markets at a moment of time where they struggled already, where we had already huge, let's say, a double shock of oversupply on both oil and gas markets, plus a slump in demand. And now you have really the situation that we've seen unorderly structural breaks in those markets, where some even ask, is this already a kind of moment for the energy transition? Is this an acceleration, or is this, what are we seeing here already? This is the question mark. Are we seeing already peak demand? So this is kind of how I would set the scene. And of course, we know that we might use some of the structural breaks or ruptures that we've seen, but it of course has to be much more better governed and steered if we transition. And I think this is the task now in the European Union.
Excellent. That sets the stage actually on many, many issues, the majority of which I will leave for subsequent issues, because they actually work much better in terms of what I thought of all issues, to return to all the issues that have to do with policy convergence. So I will leave that for the time being. But before we move to the technical discussion, or at least the more technical discussion we're about to have, let me ask you a follow-up question, because I think this is the right place to do it, which is that you mentioned a number of developments that are not necessarily COVID related, but are COVID certainly accelerated, like the effect that the crisis has had on an already challenged oil and gas industry. I mean, a few years ago, not that long ago, people were speaking about peak oil. I don't think that discussion is going to come back anytime soon. Now, as you said, we are talking about peak demand that is being lowered continuously, in addition to technical innovations that further drive this. But in order to link this directly to the European Green Deal, let me ask you, how much of an impact do you think that the Green Deal is likely to have on the global energy landscape, given all of those details that you already covered?
This is an excellent question, and this is, by the way, part of the project that I'm heading, the Geopolitics of Energy Transformation, where we are looking into the implications for foreign and international policies and relations that are kicked off by the energy transformation. And the interesting thing is that I think we have to think about energy transitions, not one, because we have a number of pathways. And I would see the EU as a forefront here, but not detached from the environment and the international landscape, because I mean, we all know that the Paris Agreement is out there, and we assume that this will govern the energy transformation with the NDCs. And we sometimes forget, with having this normative idea, and don't get me wrong, I think it's very important, but it is still a political project where you need a sustaining consensus among the countries to really commit. And then I think this is the challenge now for the EU, well, internally, to really pursue and proceed with the Green Deal, but also to work on a corresponding international environment. So what I think is that the EU needs partners out there. And the big challenge is now that the environment, to say the least, is unfriendly in many ways. We have the geo-economic rivalry between the US and China, with not only the digital divide, but really the geo-economic divide, where there is a big pressure on the EU to position itself. We do see the multilateral order tumbling, which again affects or shakens multilateral agreements like the Paris Agreement per se. And then we have the market conditions, which are also kind of unfriendly with low fossil fuel costs, not only the oil market, but also the gas market. I mean, we're just waiting now. We had discussions over the last weeks when we would see the first negative gas prices in Europe. And so the opportunity costs for moving towards more sustainability to renewable energy are really, well, actually increasing the opportunity costs. So it is really now the moment, and I think the IEA is very outspoken here, is really the moment now for governmental policies and a prudent, internal and external policies of the EU.
Well, let's return to that point next, the idea of governance being so important. But before we do that, let's turn the discussion over, first of all, to include Nestor Fylaktos as well. And I wanted to get his perspective on the technical feasibility of the European Green Deal. And the reason why I think this is so important is that we have had a trajectory, as I said at the very beginning, of policy initiatives. So in the beginning, we were thinking in sort of 5-year terms, and then it became 10-year terms and so on. And now we have this very comprehensive, very multifaceted set of tools and policy options that set the stage for the next 30 years. I mean, if we think back what the world was like 30 years ago, I don't think people could have predicted exactly what the world would be like today. So can we predict what the world will be like 30 years from now? I mean, I'm not asking you to do that, of course, to predict what the world would be like exactly, but do you think that right now we are at a stage of technological development where it is feasible and practical to be speaking of what these policy agendas are going to achieve 30 years from now?
It's hard for me as well. It's feasible, but it's probably not practical yet. But I'll come back to that point. First of all, thanks, Odysseas, and thanks, Kirsten, for the initial comments. I have a few things to add to the initial discussion, if you don't mind. First of all, as you know, the EU is a big market, but in the global scale, the global emissions are about 10%. So we're talking about an initiative that we're doing within our continent that is, at a global perspective, relatively small. But Europe is paving the way, and it's one of its goals through this Green Deal, but generally of its vision for the future, is to show that what we're trying to do here is technically feasible to the rest of the world, and dispelling the reservations that is not a reality. This is called the avant-garde. That's where Europe is, or wants to place itself. Of course, it also wants to develop innovative technologies to do that, to support its sometimes ailing industries, in order to allow the Green Deal to become a reality. But we shouldn't forget that this is not just a cold calculation from the European industries. It's basically, it's a noble, has a noble motivation behind it. Europe feels that it's a duty to do something about climate change. And perhaps this is our last chance. And this point should be hammered home that we shouldn't be delaying anymore. However, unfortunately, in this case, Europe has to blaze its own path alone, because multilateralism has shown to be rather ineffective. From the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, as Kirsten said previously, these are political agreements which don't really have any binding effect to them. And countries tend to prefer to take the path of least resistance. Now, the good thing about this 2050 goal, the net zero, is that it doesn't leave any wiggle room to member states to converge to the mean, as we have been seeing so far. Reductions in one country could be offset in not so deep reductions in others, so we kind of meet somewhere in the middle. Now, if your goal is zero, there is no basically other interpretation than decarbonizing. Of course, there is still some wiggle room when we're talking about negative emission technology, but we'll come back to that. Now, is it technically feasible? Well, yes and no. I had a discussion with a colleague earlier, because we are actually doing some modeling here, supporting the NCP for the government of Cyprus. And he told me, of course it is. It's just a matter of cost, how much it costs. I'm not sure I agree 100% with that, but it would be kind of a close approximation to what the situation is. Let's not forget that the European Green Deal is very horizontal. It is not about the energy sector only. It has agriculture in, it has all sorts of different things which contribute to emissions, even though energy is the biggest one. So even if we could say that it can happen, it's a question of cost, and it's also a cost of inertia. Energy systems don't change overnight so easily. The European technologies obviously want to take advantage of economies of scale and reduce costs, as I said. One of recent example is how top-down policies have reduced the costs of PV, because we have these feed-in tariff schemes, and they have allowed, especially in Europe, those things to spread very, very rapidly. And this actually allowed globally the photovoltaics to reduce in cost and price. We also have the national plans of governments, and recently we have the submissions of the national energy climate plans of individual member states, which have been criticized, and rightly in my opinion, that they have not been ambitious enough, and they are a bit out of step of what the Green Deal tries to achieve. But without going into too much detail, as I understand, we're talking about, we'll try to explain these things without going into too many, let's say, too much jargon. There is broadly two ways to do that. One of them has already been mentioned by Kirsten. The first one is electrification of everything. So there you have a vision where you have electric cars, which is going to be the main driver of converting private transportation. You have the displacement of traditional fossil fuel generation in the electricity sector by renewables, and that could mean renewables coupled with storage, because you cannot do it otherwise. You cannot rely on PV and wind when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And this also includes technologies which are still a bit on the fringes, but may become part of the mainstream in the future. For example, concentrated solar power with thermal storage. Right now, they consist a small part of the market, but systems like that start to appear here and there, even in large scales. And these can actually answer the question of baseload generation. What happens when we don't have all these things? This could also mean the electrification of heating and cooling, which is also a challenging issue. Heating and cooling generally is supplied, especially in the north of Europe, by gas. In this case, we are going to be investing a lot on heat pumps. And also, of course, we should not forget the increase in demand due to the increased need for air conditioning units, especially in the south, because of the increase in temperature. Which is also connected to the COVID discussion we had earlier, we will have changes in how public transportation is viewed by consumers, because right now there's some aversion to using public transportation, and this is actually impacting a lot the budgets of such companies in big cities. I read recently that in New York, actually, the system there is almost to the brink of collapse, because there is no demand and nobody's using it anymore. So if you don't have the option of using your car, and you don't really have that option in many cities, especially in the north of Europe, then micromobility schemes may start appearing and become much more prevalent. And their country and city planners will have to play a role. E-bikes, scooters, things like that will become more prominent as a means of, which also are also on the bandwagon of electrification. So that's one. The second one will be kind of a combination of liquid fuels as a vision for the future, which will include synthetic fuels and, as things stand, most probably hydrogen. But there are question marks about whether that's feasible and when that's going to happen, at what costs, and in which countries. This has the benefit of actually addressing the issue of how we're going to be dealing with industries. Industries are hard to decarbonize, especially the ones that use high-grade heat. We're talking about temperatures over 500-600. This is difficult to do with electrification. And also, hydrogen is an energy vector in itself. It can be used in transportation. It can also be used in homes, in fuel cells, for example, in the basement of your home, so you can power all your devices with it. So it is a very interesting vision for the future. It solves many problems in one go, but there is still the question of the difference between clean and green hydrogen. In clean hydrogen, you basically have steam reforming of gas, and then gas companies think that this is a good idea because you can marry it with CCS, with carbon capture and storage, and the CO2 that is emitted from this process can be driven back underground. But green hydrogen, on the other hand, uses electrolyzers and uses the electrolysis of water. And the energy input for that process could be renewable electricity produced by wind, PV, you name it. Still unclear how this future will play out, in which countries, and in what sort of mix between those two. I mentioned industry. There's two sectors which are still is going to be the last hurdles in order for decarbonization. One of them is shipping, the other one is aviation. These are going to be kind of tall obstacles to overcome. There is talk about ammonia in shipping, which is connected well to the hydrogen future, but ammonia has its advantages because it's denser, but it also has drawbacks because it's very flammable. And aviation, on the other hand, is still going to be probably harder. We're talking about synthetic fuels here, perhaps, maybe hydrogen, but that's far away into the future. So to sum it all up, because this is not something that we have been, there's lots of institutions and organizations and universities that are thinking about this, and they have published extensively reports and analysis on how a decarbonized future will look like for Europe. And it's a common consensus for everyone that going to 90% decarbonization is not going to be that difficult. We have the tools, we have the technologies, it's just a matter of political will and perhaps some increased cost. The last 10%, however, from going from almost decarbonized to net zero is the hardest of them all, because you have some sectors which are very difficult to be decarbonized, and then you have to introduce negative emissions, like CCUS, as I said, carbon capture, utilization and storage, but also natural sinks in forests, in the ocean, in many places where carbon can be stored naturally. So, as a kind of a conclusion to what I've said, my final word about this is that yes, technically we can do it. Maybe we are in a kind of an immature level right now, but as things appear to be going, we will have the tools to do that in the next few years. But I have my doubts whether it's going to be easy or feasible to reach zero. It's going to be easy and feasible to reach 90%, maybe 95%. In some countries easier than others. But the zero and the vision that for 2050 is challenging. It has been documented, and we will obviously revisit that issue in the future, but right now that's how things stand.
Thank you, Nestor, for that very comprehensive overview of where we are right now, but also where we're likely to be in the near future, which gives us a better indication of the likelihood, as you said, of success in this. And as you put it, 90% seems relatively easy, and then the rest would be perhaps a lot more challenging. Both of you have centered on the issue of electrification, and I think that gives me a good segue to sort of broaden the horizon of that discussion, because that is nothing new, right? In addition to all the initiatives that have been more on the environmental side, we have had all of the initiatives that have taken place purely on the energy side. And more than anything, this is exemplified in the energy packages. And the fourth energy package came at a time more or less concurrent with the European Green Deal. So I want to lead the discussion in that direction, and also integrate it with a few of the things that Kirsten mentioned earlier, and ask her, to what extent do you think the policy implementation side of the EGD is feasible? More specifically, what I'm thinking about is the amount of policy convergence that is going to be necessary in order to make all of those developments that Nestor outlined for us, not only commercially viable, economically viable, but also politically expedient, and lead to the goals that we want to achieve within the next few years. And the reason why I mentioned the electrification is because I wanted to combine this perspective of the European Green Deal with an assessment of the impact of the fourth energy package. And more than anything else, I was thinking in terms of the accelerating energy union. So we see the issue of governance. You also mentioned the issue, and actually Nestor mentioned it as well, of multilateralism and its failings, the international dimension. But we're also seeing a lot of movement on the regional level, on the level of the EU, of pushing towards policy convergence. And there's a clear understanding that it's not just about, lofty goals, but also the mechanisms that will get us there. How do you assess the feasibility of this?
Is that a question to me?
Yes.
Yes,
Primarily.
Dr. Christou, yeah, to both. I would start by again highlighting the point of policy convergence. I think this is extremely important, and also the parallelity of steps that have to be undertaken. Because also, as Nestor said, it's really very horizontal, this Green Deal. And I think this can't be underestimated and is part of this big challenge. My second point is, indeed, I mean, we had in the Energy Union, we had this at the start of this, and you mentioned that multilateral governance scheme with the national energy and climate plans. And we are right at the beginning. And now you have again the Green Deal with a real acceleration, and plus the recovery program is also something that has to be steered and governed and decided. So I think it is really a tremendous paramount challenge to EU governance. And I'm not talking about the global governance issue, but really within the EU. And then I think what are ways forward? I think we have kind of policy tools or governance tools at hands and fora and instruments, which I would first mention the kind of regional cooperation. I think this is extremely important, that at least outside of Germany, I can see that we have, for example, a pentalateral forum where we exchange with our electricity neighbors issues like cross-border unintended electricity flows. And these are kind of regional zones or regional clusters that can move forward. So I think my first point is regional cooperation. Then I think we have to think this horizontal challenge as kind of sector integration and energy system integration. And there again, I mean, we have just started to link the electricity network planning with the gas network planning. I mean, this has just started, and still member states are lagging behind with this exercise. Mm-hmm. But actually what we would need right now in order to avoid lock-in effects is really kind of another network planning for hydrogen or blending hydrogen into the gas grid. So I'm mentioning that in order to show that we at many levels there need to be now parallel concerted actions, and network planning is the next, which could be started of course at the regional level, but has to be European wide. And then in parallel, of course, we have seen ACER, the Association of Energy Regulators, is a key institution, and it is now again a key institution in, for example, starting regulation of a hydrogen grid, for example. So I think it is really a challenge where you have this bottom-up processes in the national energy and climate plans, which have to be, of course, revisited now under the Green Deal and the new communications. But it is also a necessity to work together regionally. And there we have functioning, so to say, regions and others which are lagging behind in this cooperation. And then really it's about network planning and adapting regulation. But this is really something that has to take place in parallel. And this is a huge challenge for also the EU Commission to steer that and to kickstart that.
Okay, well, look. The MC initiative altogether mainly focuses on the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, we have been discussing about something that has far-reaching consequences that, as both of you have explained, serves as a kind of model, not just for the EU, definitely not for the region, but for the entire continent, and also as a kind of beacon for the rest of the international system, maybe. At least if as successful as we have been discussing in the near future. But I wanted also to allow us some time to discuss actual impact on the region. the European Green Deal comes at a time of both geopolitical and economic volatility in energy developments in the region. I wanted to ask you both the extent to which you think the EGD differentiates the prospects of these developments that we've been seeing in the region. So I'm thinking about this in two ways. One is, what makes the Eastern Mediterranean? Obviously, there are issues of different climate, different geography, geology, and all sorts of things. I mean, Europe is a large continent, so not all regions face the same challenges. Do you think that the European Green Deal addresses some of the more specific characteristics of the region? That's the first point. And then the second, to make this more of an issue with respect to energy as such, is that we've seen a number of developments in the region, and I don't want to focus too much on the geopolitical aspect, but on the effect of the European Green Deal on existing patterns, which we've seen both during the crisis, and this is an ongoing crisis, but we can have some idea of what the future might be. So I wanted to ask Nestor first. What do you think the impact is going to be on these developments that we've seen? On oil and gas on the one hand in the region, and then secondly, the broader aspect of the impact of the EGD.
It would be great for me to say that I can answer this very briefly, but it's a very complex topic, and it's almost impossible not to touch on geopolitics if you actually try to address this. However, I'll have a go. Look, in Europe, if the European Green Deal actually delivers what it promises to deliver, then we will have certainly a reduction of demand for hydrocarbons. This is a given. It doesn't take a genius to understand that. However, the impact of what this will mean for the Eastern Mediterranean is a little more nuanced. Right now, there's a global trend basically towards increased demand for natural gas. This is documented in IEA reports, and pretty much all international organizations that actually do forecasts for energy kind of agree on that. The reason is that they try to marry that with increased global demand in general, but because natural gas can act as a bridge fuel towards a future of lower emissions, where it replaces coal for the most part, but also oil, where it is used for electricity generation, but also transportation. There is a drop in demand significantly in a global scale after 2040, at least in some of the scenarios. The problem with the Eastern Mediterranean is that the gas that we have here, that we have found, is very difficult to sell because it's expensive. We're talking about an environment where the global markets are really low. They have been low because of the behavior of OPEC last year, but also the COVID came in, and now basically, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're talking about possible negative price of gas. So in the global markets for the gas in the Eastern Mediterranean will probably be inaccessible, and this will be even exacerbated even more if the European Green Deal does what it's supposed to be doing. We're talking about here of a high cost of extraction, liquefaction, transportation of the gas. These are plays which are actually deep waters, at least the Cypriot plays, the Egyptians not so much. Right now, all companies or all major companies, all companies are looking at the prospects of the region and are kind of backing off because these are very risky prospects, and they because of the immense financial hit they have sustained, and still sustaining because of the virus, they're looking into their assets that they have, which are the most certain, the most secure ones, and they don't want to be taking risks in place in the air, because not only for techno-economic reasons, but also for political reasons. But we said that we're not going to be focusing that on too much. Also, the demand for gas that I mentioned at the beginning, because of the Green Deal, is not going to be in Europe. The demand is mostly going to be in Asia. It's going to be in probably China and India, and to a lesser extent in Korea and Japan. So taking the Eastern Mediterranean gas from here to there is a huge undertaking. And there is lots of liquefaction facilities now appearing in the northern coast of Australia, The Gulf can supply these regions much cheaper. So the global picture somehow is a bit inaccessible for the gas here. So that actually leaves behind the regional market. The regional market consists of a few European players, Greece and Italy and Cyprus, but also lots of Middle Eastern and Northern African countries. Cyprus could actually have a role, and the gas of the region in general could be, let's say, diverted or consumed within that region, but without actually having the prospects of a globalized market supply. Turkey is obviously an example of high demand in gas, but for the Cypriot gas, of course, this is out of the question. Egypt is a peculiar case because it has export facilities in 2 locations, but it also imports gas from Israel to satisfy its internal demand. So all these issues for hydrocarbons mean that I would think that the excitement of the regional countries for the gas developments should be tempered. The probability of actually monetizing these plays, especially for the more difficult ones, is low. And the regional market will not be so lucrative and will not be able to serve us soon. We're talking about 5-10 years down the line. So that is an indirect impact that the Green Deal would have to the region, because basically we cannot divert the gas where the region would have liked to go. Even though there's discussion about the Eastern Med gas pipeline to Greece and Italy, which has a political backing, but it has its techno-economic shortcomings, and I'm not so certain that actually will ever happen. Interconnection also between countries is an issue here. There is this discussion about electricity, the electrical connection between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, or through this project, which again may happen, but in a way it isn't such a big deal in the grand scheme of things. So that's how I see the Green Deal playing. Now the region itself could play a role. Kirsten actually mentioned earlier about the importance of regional communication. This is of paramount importance here. The region needs some sort of, I wouldn't say alignment, but at least some sort of communication channel in order to set its sights on its own decarbonization and lower emissions goals. By the way, this is something that we're already doing here at the Institute. We have an initiative called the Cyprus Climate Initiative, which is brokered by the President of the Republic, and it's operated by us, this is actually what we're trying to do, communicate with countries of the region and GCC countries and try to kind of come up with a common vision. So this is something that is needed. And just a final point is that the region has been very obsessed with oil and hydrocarbons. We need some sort of diversification. Some countries are rich, some less so. And I think that the region needs some sort of communication and collaboration on innovative R&D projects and activities in the region, in order to align itself with what the Green Deal is trying to do on the European side. So I would think that yes, if the Green Deal is successful and it does what it does, not just for Europe but for the rest of the world, then the region will somehow has to realign its priorities. Let's put it this way.
Kirsten, would you like to add something to this point?
Yeah, sure, but Nestor didn't leave much to add, but maybe I would mirror that from a European side. And I would be even more blunt. I mean, if the EU is serious about the Green Deal, it has to look into its project of common interest. And then decarbonizing the projects of common interest is important. So I really don't see a future for the Eastern Mediterranean gas pipeline if the EU is serious about that. Of course, you have other considerations, maybe geopolitical ones, but against the background of the Green Deal, there is actually no future for this gas pipeline, also because of the situation that Nestor mentioned on the global gas markets. And also, I think what comes in here is the issue of investments that Nestor highlighted. And just to back this by figures, we've seen a drop of -20% of investments into all energy infrastructure. And of course, the companies that Nestor highlighted or lined up, they are among those that deeply cut, that made deep cuts. So we look into public money. And then again, you can't really spend in this time public European money for these kind of projects. So it will be dedicated to the European Green Deal. And even if I talk about geopolitics under this wider scheme, there is not only from the wider, let's start it again, from the wider geopolitical perspective, we have also the China challenge with regard to electrification, with regard to standards. And then I think it would be a chance for the EU to think about electric connections in this Eastern Mediterranean neighborhood, where you have really key players, and Nestor mentioned them, like Egypt linking into Saudi Arabia, linking Israel, Cyprus with Greece, Italy, maybe. So what I'm going to say is also geopolitically, electricity will be much more important than in the past, and we shouldn't forget that. Just to maybe highlight why I'm saying that, look, we are synchronizing the Baltics because of geopolitical reasons. We are synchronizing Ukraine for geopolitical reasons. So now really electrification and synchronization is becoming a geopolitical tool. And this is why I think for Cyprus, it is really the challenge is really to leapfrog and jump into renewable electrification or renewable generation, and then exporting electricity, maybe exporting hydrogen in the next decades via electrolyzers.
We have actually, this is a discussion we keep having. The advantage of Cyprus is that it's an isolated energy system, which of course is not an advantage in itself, because we would like that not to be the case. But since it is actually great, let's say, backdrop for doing tests for new technologies and new energy generation, where we can actually control all the variables without the noise of interconnections, which noise is usually welcome, but in this case, if you want to control your environment, it's actually ideal. So we're talking about a system which has very small distances, so you can actually do also sorts of transportation sort of innovation. It has an electricity network which is fairly stable, even though it's a bit centralized, and we have seen what happened in 2011 with that explosion. We also have a very high demand in the summer, but very low in the autumn and spring. So you have these very large valleys and troughs in the demand profile. And you have a climate which is very similar to what you find actually in the Eastern Mediterranean countries, which makes it ideal for testing things like desalination, polygeneration, all sorts of innovative ideas for the energy transition, the energy future. And that is, I think, one of the roles that the region can play. Maybe we shouldn't expect a unified goal to net zero 2050 for the Eastern Mediterranean. That is unrealistic. There is no political body to either implement or suggest that. But it can become a hotbed of technology innovation. And given the fact that Europe will actually be moving away from that, what better opportunity than now?
Well, we started this particular part of the discussion on a relatively quite pessimistic note of basically, I think all three of us in agreement that many of the developments that we've seen in the area are actually not going to be viable in the near future. But we ended up, especially thanks to Nestor's final point, on a very optimistic note about the possibilities of not only Cyprus, but also for the region. Now, we are just about out of time, but we have a few questions from the audience. I think some of it has already been answered, but I would like to ask at least one of them. And so I want to ask you really briefly, if we can, the question posed is, do we have other similar trends in any other parts of the world? And then the follow-up, because I think this needs a follow-up, we would be very short to answer, I think, is do you think that we will see similar trends in other parts of the world?
Depends on how the US election goes, is the answer.
Sorry? I didn't
Depends on
quite
how the US election goes. We may actually.
That's actually a very interesting point. I mean, you both mentioned this earlier, like the failures of multilateralism. And of course, multilateralism has also been put on hold on these discussions. I mean, you both mentioned the Paris agreement, and that is up for renegotiation, and it's being put on hold at the moment. And a lot of this has to do with political will, and what Nestor mentioned, especially if our viewers are not that familiar with the geopolitics. I mean, there is no bigger player than the United States in terms of defining the possibility of a shift towards a multilateralism that will be on board with what the Europeans are suggesting. Kirsten, would you like to add something?
No, I was also thinking about California, eastern US states, and yeah, indeed. I mean, it did really a question how the US election goes. But I mean, there are others, countries in Latin America are moving forward too, but just from another level. So I think it's really the avant-garde in the EU, which has to show that it's possible, and then have also to, has to develop the necessary technologies and be an innovation hub.
Okay, well, we are just about on time. I want to thank you both for a very stimulating discussion. Obviously, we could have spent hours on even like the final point that we were discussing. Thank you for bringing so many details and characteristics and specificities of what is essentially a very complex situation, especially for people who are not versed in these issues to understand. So Kirsten Westphal, Nestor Fylaktos, thank you again for your participation. And thank you to our audience who have been with us, perhaps not just for this topic, for the entire MC series. Thank you.